So the Romans are leading the charge, and they are firmly embedded in Mediterranean culture. That only makes sense if they're from the Mediterranean in the first place. They say Troy, I say Crete. The DNA kind of supports both, but really Crete by a country mile. So does the archaeology. I'll show you. This is important because my theory rivals the standard theory as to who the Romans are and where they came from. It's mostly a linguistic case. It's strong, but it's not airtight. As for the rest, it's mostly wishful thinking. I would even kick that up to denial. They flat out blow off the archaeology and the DNA. I'll show you that too. But I'm going to start with the DNA. I introduced a lot of it in my series on the Festus disk, but even more has come out since I did that series, and every time more comes out, my case just gets stronger. But I'm going to start with a shout out to my own little subset of the tribe, the men with the J2A M92Y chromosome. We were among those who introduced Minoan civilization to Crete. But before then, all of us got our start in Turkey during the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. Some of us are still there. The core remnant of my people are in central Anatolia near Lake Tuz. We make up about 5% of the population there. That's the Salt Lake in Turkish. This larger area I've marked out here is our extended range. Our population, still in Turkey, sweeps up to the northeast and tends to mirror the Shiite population you see marked in dark green here. And since there's also a high concentration of Shiites in our core territory, for a while I thought we tended to be Shiites, although I thought wrong. I'll cover that very soon. There are also quite a few of us in the region surrounding Istanbul, which I still call Constantinople. I talked about that in the part 1 of my series of the Festus Disc. Now you will note that the city of Kayseri sits right at the boundary of our core territory. This is the Turkish pronunciation of Caesarea. So just like Israel during the time of Christ, we have a salty body of water in a city named Caesarea. It was renamed in honor of Augustus Caesar upon his death in 14 AD. I wasn't surprised when I discovered it was also highly ranked economically, an Anatolian tiger. This is from the report Islamic Calvinists, Change and Conservatism in Central Anatolia. Olli Rehn says Kayseri is the heart of Anatolia, and he wants to go to Kayseri and get to know this developing Anatolian city that has advanced so much. In the meantime, the report of the European Stability Initiative talks about Kayseri as Anatolians' loudest voice on the road to the EU. Let's look at the details of this report. What renders this city such a success? What is it that makes its economy so strong? According to the report, Kayseri is also an example demonstrating that Islam and Western values can coexist in Turkey, and Kayseri is the best answer to those who oppose Turkey's European Union membership because of cultural, religious, and social differences. I'm not surprised that we and the other J2As in the area of Kayseri are so compatible with European civilization. That's compatible with the idea that we started European civilization. So we're going to start with Caesarea, and we're going to superimpose a map of the Hittite Empire when it was in its full bloom. The first conquest of the Hittites came out of Kanish. We call these people the Hittites, and we call their speech Hittite, but they called it Nessa, or the speech of Nessa, which was their name for Kanish. But one time that we know of, they even called it Kanisumnili, in the speech of the people of Kanish. From there, they moved north and conquered the Hattic city of Hattusa, which a couple of centuries before had successfully repelled an attack from the old Assyrian Empire. Now let's take this map away and pop back on the general outline of our core territory, and then our extended range. And let's bring back the map. This is pretty close to a map of the old Hittite kingdom before the Hittites began their march to empire. At the height of their power, they fought the Egyptians at the famous Battle of Kadesh. It was one of the greatest battles in the ancient world, and probably the largest chariot fight in the history of the world. The Egyptians claimed to have won, but couldn't take the city. Later, they would acknowledge the Hittite control of that city, and therefore the key trade routes it commanded. I'll go back to this southern region later when I talk about the Balak. Who they are supports the idea that we are in fact the Hittites. But since there are so many of us in Turkey, I thought I would see if we were involved in the Armenian Genocide. If you haven't heard of it, it's because we're only allowed to worship at the altar of the one true genocide. And a lot of skeletons would come tumbling out if we got to the bottom of this one. It's when I was looking into this that I saw that we were not, in fact, Shiites. Here's an ethnic map of Turkey. Here's the general outline of our boundaries again. Now let's bring in the map of the Armenian Genocide. Then we'll withdraw our ethnic map with the side of the various massacres that the Armenians marked. The bigger the X, the bigger the massacre. As you can see, some happened deep in our territory, specifically at Caesarea. That's firmly in our territory. But here we have a massacre in Kurdish territory. Then another here on a boundary between my tribe and the Turkoman. Then up in a fuzzy area shared by us and the Kurds. And who knows, maybe it's firmly in our territory. As you can see from Caesarea, the ethnic map and the map of the Armenian massacres don't exactly line up. So right now it's a toss-up. But even if these massacres were in our territory, it doesn't mean we were involved. The people who actually planned them, many of whom were not even ethnically Turkish, used gangs of released prisoners to do a lot of their dirty work. Although, I am quick to add, many locals joined in. I'm not trying to let my people off the hook here, but I'm not going to let them take a hit either if they don't deserve it. This is a serious charge to lay on a race, and I believe everybody has a right to defend themselves from an accusation of genocide. The tell here is the death camps. Mass massacres can happen bolt out of the blue, especially if they're planned carefully ahead and all the hatchet men are lined up, which is true in both cases here. They emptied out the prisons so they can get these gangs together. Death camps are qualitatively different. They're permanent installations that call for the kind of personnel that would be noticeable in a local population. If you told me you didn't know about your neighborhood death camp, I wouldn't believe you. Word gets around. As you can see, all of the camps are firmly outside of the areas where my people have the largest presence. Not even close. Okay, let's bring on the DNA. Put on your thinking cap and get yourself a cup of coffee because I'm about to throw a lot at you. Everything we're about to work through comes from ancient migratory events in the Middle East, new clues from the Y chromosome variation of modern Iranians. We're going to look at the migration map of J2A men who represent three different bloodlines, the M530s, the M67s, and the M92s. I'm an M92, and we're a subclade of M67, so we come from them. If you watch my series on the Festus disc, you're familiar with these last two. I'll cover them again in even more detail, so don't worry if you didn't. I need the M530s as a reality check for my people, and for my case. So I'll start with them. These maps are split into two panels and represent two sets of data streams. On the left, we've got frequency distribution. Where are all these men now? When DNA results started coming out, a lot of people jumped the gun and came to bad conclusions about my people, because where we all are now might not be where we came from. Lots of men like me live in southern Italy, for example, but that's not where we're from. This is where the second panel comes in. This is the variance distribution. All things being equal, the longer you've been living in an area, the more variety you've got going because of mutations. This is when all things are being equal. But in one particular instance, that view is actually going to trip you up. It really tripped me up in the beginning. Here's a good example. The variance distribution shows a lot of 530s in the Iranian city of Ray. It's a deep red, but there aren't a lot of men there now. Same with the Iranian city of Shiraz. The variance distribution pays off when we look at the Iranian city of Yazd. Yes, the 530s have been there a while, but notice in the regions where they've probably lived the longest, they don't have a lot of people there today. Yet in the city of Yazd, we have a sudden spike in their numbers. So we're looking at a major migration, and a fairly recent one. From the historical record, we know that Yazd was a refuge for Zoroastrians during the Islamic conquest of Iran, so that was probably them. There are still a lot of Zoroastrians there, but over the centuries most have converted to Islam. Now here's a reality check for my case on the Romans. The 530s are in the Balkan Peninsula. Notice the obvious population drift, east to west. They might have been part of the Caranovo Stone Age culture because that's where it's centered. Now another reality check. Southern Italy. They migrated from the south to the north. Here's another indicator of a past migration. There are a lot of these men in Lebanon, but they haven't necessarily been there that long. Now note this because it might be important later. There are quite a few of these men in the Caucasus Mountains, and they appear to have been there a while. Now let's start with the J2A M67 men, and let's start with a bang. King Belshazzar gave a banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, with whom he drank. Under the influence of the wine, he ordered the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, to be brought in so that the king, his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines might drink from them. When the gold vessels taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, had been brought in, and while the king, his nobles, his consorts, and his concubines were drinking wine from them, they praised their gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Suddenly, opposite the lampstand, the fingers of a human hand appeared, writing on the plaster of the wall in the king's palace. When the king saw the hand that wrote, his face became pale, his thoughts terrified him, his hip joints shook, and his knees knocked. Later they bring in Daniel. This is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Tekel, and Perez. These words mean, Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then by order of Belshazzar they clothed Daniel in purple, with a chain of gold around his neck, and proclaimed him third in governing the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain.
Guess who the Medes and the Persians are?
These are the Medes. These are the Persians. The M67s are dead center on both, and as you can see, they've been on those same spots since at least Bible times. And here's their empire, the biggest in the world up to that time. Nobody came close. They conquered Babylon and sent the Jews back to Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah treats their leader Cyrus the Great as a Messiah figure. We Christians understand he's the type of our Lord Jesus Christ, who will likewise bring us back home. Now we go over to Italy, where we see the M67s were northerners originally, as they still are today. Here they are in the area around Constantinople. Here in the same spot, they disappear. What happened? They're recent immigrants. Constantinople was built and settled after 300 AD. And here they are in the Balkans. Now the M530s had that clear east to west movement that you'd expect from a Stone Age migration. Notice the M67s, west to east. And you can see they're still there, though many immigrated to Italy after the Muslims conquered the Balkans.
So the Romans and the Persians are cousins. I told you we were shapeshifters. Nobody in a million years would have ever guessed that. When I was doing my series on the Festus disc, I made the case, admittedly shaky, but I did pull it from the disc, that the Minoans on Crete might have been Zoroastrians. Well, the Romans are from Crete, so the Cretans and the Persians are cousins. So there's your bridge right there. Now the movement across the Balkans is important, because if you look on the internet, everybody will tell you that we're Stone Age immigrants to Italy and warriors swooped in from the north and they conquered us and the warriors are the Romans. Well, there's not one shred of evidence backing that up, and this movement across the Balkans seriously undermines the case. We're moving west to east and not east to west, and I know why. In fact, here's a map.
I'll read the posting on this road, the Via Ignatia, on Wikipedia from February 13th, 2015, as we look it over. Construction started in 146 BC, so as Romans we'd been using it for a long time. The Via Ignatia was constructed in order to link a chain of Roman colonies stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Bosphorus. The termini of the Via Ignatia and the Via Appia leading from Rome itself were almost directly opposite each other on the east and west shores of the Adriatic Sea. The route thus gave the colonies of the southern Balkans a direct connection to Rome. It was also a vital link to Roman territories further to the east, until a more northerly route across Illyria was opened under Augustus. It was Rome's main link with her empire in the eastern Mediterranean. It was repaired and expanded several times, but experienced lengthy periods of neglect due to Rome's civil wars. The road was used by the Apostle Paul on his second missionary journey as he traveled from Philippi to Thessalonica. It also played a vital role in several key moments in Roman history. The armies of Julius Caesar and Pompey marched along the Via Ignatia during Caesar's civil war, and during the Liberator's civil war, Mark Antony and Octavian pursued Cassius and Brutus along the Via Appia to their fateful meeting at the Battle of Philippi. Surviving milestones record that the Emperor Trajan undertook extensive repairs of the road prior to his campaign of 113 against the Parthians. Those are in Iran. However, by the 5th century AD, the road had largely fallen into disuse as a result of violent instability in the region. A 5th century historian noted that the western sections of the Via Ignatia were in such a poor state that travelers could barely pass along it. In later years, the Via Ignatia was revived as a key road of the Byzantine Empire. Procopius records repairs made by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I during the 6th century, although even then the dilapidated road was said to be virtually unusable during wet weather. Almost all Byzantine overland trade with Western Europe traveled along the Via Ignatia. During the Crusades, armies traveling to the east by land followed the road to Constantinople before crossing into Asia Minor. In the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, control of the road was vital for the survival of the Latin Empire, as well as the Byzantine successor states, the Empire of Nicaea and the Despotate of Epirus.
This is a very Roman road. Together with the Via Appia, the queen of the long roads, it directly linked the old capital of Rome with the new capital of Constantinople, and it did it for 500 years. And then it did it for 1,000 more years as a Christian road. Back to the map.
Here you can see there the Georgians. Now once again this is the Caucasus, and once again this is important. I'll show you why later. Here you see they've been in Georgia for several thousand years. Here they are, mostly in Spain, but also Portugal. As you can see, they've been here a while. Not as long as in Italy, but longer than Constantinople. Once again, exactly what you'd expect if we were the Romans. We took southern Spain from the Carthaginians more than 500 years before we moved to Constantinople. Here's a map of Roman colonies, as at the time of the Emperor Trajan, on top of a map of J2As in Europe. You can see our Spanish colonies are in the southwest and sweep up to the northeast, which is exactly what the J2As do on the peninsula. The connection between us and the empire is so rock solid, I've discovered that every time I need to see why we've got a bunch of J2As sitting in the middle of nowhere, I can always look at a map of the empire and her colonies. In this case, this pocket on the Rhine River. This is the French region of Alsace, and it's passed back and forth between the various German principalities and France several times. The Romans had heavily invested both personnel and infrastructure in it.
So last but not least, we have my tribe, the M92s. We're a subclade of M67s, and we both come from the same part of the world.
Well, here we are in Constantinople, just like the M67s. There are a lot of us there, but we haven't been there for long. And here we are in southern Italy. Southern Italians? No, we're northern Italians, Romans. You can see that from the variance distribution.
One of the reasons why there are so many M92s in southern Italy is because it has Albanian descendants of refugees from the Balkan Peninsula when it fell to the Turks. Together, M92s and M67s make up almost 13% of the population. That's a lot higher than Albania today. I think these are actually Roman descendants who had blended into Albanian culture after living there for several centuries. Why? Because Albanians are overwhelmingly J2B. That clade split from us back in the Stone Age.
Speaking of the Balkans, you can see we virtually disappeared from there. Although from looking at the variance distribution, you can see we once had a large presence, once again confirming that these Albanians are Roman refugees. And as you know, I think we're the Hittites. Most would probably say we're the indigenous Hattic-speaking population the Hittites conquered.
I sat on the fence on that. Conqueror or conquered, it could go either way. I went with conqueror after I thought about the Baloch. That's coming right up.
Over here in the east, you see we're concentrated in the world-famous city of Isfahan. This is a UN World Heritage Site. There are a lot of those where we live. Looking over here at the variants, you can see we've been here a while, I suspect since before Christ. Now here's a really interesting bunch of M92s. They're the Baloch. There are a lot of them here, and as you can see, they haven't been here long. We actually know from the historical record they've lived here for hundreds of years, but only really started pouring in the past 500. The Baloch have a tradition that they're from Aleppo in Syria, which would make absolute sense if we were the Hittites.
And it's the Baloch who are repeating our history. Despite 15 centuries of their neighbors trying to murder them, they've pulled off a spectacular and heroic migration to southern Pakistan, where they've established a viable and independent culture. And in a move that I believe echoes the first conversion of a foreign people to the Indo-European language by us Anatolians, they have successfully integrated the Brahui,
who we know from DNA studies have nothing in common with them. Going by their Y chromosomes, they actually have more in common with the Russians. Back to the empire.
Up top, we have the core range and extended range of my tribe as it's developed in Turkey. Now bottom center, we'll mark Aleppo, where the Baloks say they're from. Then let's bring the map of the Hittite Empire back in. Right northwest of Aleppo, we've got the Ain Dara Temple, which Mursili II probably built when the empire was at the peak of its power. King Solomon's temple was modeled on the Ain Dara Temple, and I also thought it was interesting that his name is so similar to Mursili's father's, Supililiuma. Supililiuma was probably the greatest king the Hittites ever had, just as Solomon was the greatest of Israel's kings. After the Bronze Age collapsed, the Hittites had to retreat for the northern territories, but they somewhat recovered, forming various Syro-Hittite kingdoms that were around at the time of David and Solomon. They never regained their former glory, but they did recapture our original homeland of southern Turkey and the area around Caesarea, from which they had launched their original invasion of the Hatti. And there was a surprising amount of continuity. Carchemish, for example, was ruled by Kuziteshub I, a direct descendant of Supililiuma. His father, Talmi-Teshub, was viceroy there when the empire collapsed.
Nobody had ever heard of a Hittite empire until a little more than 100 years ago, and nobody knew the Baloks shared a Y chromosome with the men who peak in the heart of the old empire until this paper came out. And the Balak are dead certain that they came from the very region that the Hittites retreated to after their empire collapsed. Put it all together, and the only obvious conclusion you can draw is, we M92s are the Hittites.